Focus report, and this Friday we look into a dark yet little-known chapter of France and Cameroon's common history. In the 1950s and 60s, the French army fought alongside Cameroonian government forces against members of the leftist UPC movement, which it labelled as rebels. Historians say that during this little-known war, tens of thousands of people were killed. Well, France 24 talked to a crucial witness who saw massacres being committed. A report carried out in France and Cameroon by Nicolas Germain, with Marcela Moko, Zigoto Chaya, Melina Huet and Sylvain Rousseau.
In a remote village in southwest France, this former French soldier took part in a war that few people, even in France, have heard of. One which has been described as the beginning of France-Afrique, the murky relationship between Paris and its former African colonies. Bardet was sent to Cameroon between 1962 and 1964 in the western Bamileke region. He was a helicopter pilot and witnessed several massacres committed by the Cameroonian army. It was strongly supported and funded by France.
That's a Bell 47 G2, 280 horsepower, a very small helicopter, just 3 seats.
The Cameroonian army, backed by France, targeted members of the UPC, a party that opposed President Amadou Ahidjo. The UPC believed that after independence in 1960, Ahidjo was simply France's hand-picked puppet. For the first time on television, Max Bardet describes the atrocities he saw.
Soldiers of the Cameroonian army were ordered to kill the men, but not the women. Women would be left to agonize. Most had been wounded by AK-47 bullets. But not only that, what I want to say is that they would also cut off their breasts and disembowel them.
During these massacres, Max Bardet was accompanied by a French officer.
The officer who was with me was here to be on the lookout and make sure no one would witness what was going on, that no one could ever testify or accuse France and the few members of the French military still present in Cameroon of being involved in what was going on.
Bardet says he understands why many Cameroonians remain bitter.
If I were them, I would be angry with the French or with France. Yes, really, I would.
A new book on this topic called The War in Cameroon has just come out in France.
The French carried on with their military activities, albeit discreetly. They would manage or supervise operations rather than having a massive military presence on the ground. This way they could crack down on the UPC nationalists, that's the Union of Cameroonian People, but also on all those suspected of supporting this movement, the so-called subversive elements. This repression, this crackdown was so discreet it was like a secret operation. Indeed, back in France, no one was aware of the extent of these military operations. But not only were these operations off the radar, they were also extremely violent. In the 1960s, you had entire villages being destroyed in air raids. People were being forced into camps surrounded with barbed wire. Torture was becoming systematic.
The revelations in this book come after those published in the first edition, and they could have legal and financial consequences for France.
The French government is fully aware that the Mau Mau, a group that was violently repressed in Kenya in a similar way and at a similar time, sued the British government a few years ago and won compensations. Lawsuits are still being filed. So I think the French government wouldn't like to find itself in a similar position. But they're also worried of the conclusions that could be drawn from their implication in the war in Cameroon. Because beyond the violent repression, it was one of the cornerstones in building a very peculiar system of French governance, not only in Cameroon, but in all of France's former colonies in Africa. So yes, if people start taking a closer look at what happened during this war, this is something deeply worrying for the French government. And this regardless of whether the government is on the left or on the right.
In Cameroon, some still remember the massacres of the 1950s and 60s. Tadei Yemelon used to be the bodyguard of one of the UPC's leaders.
In this war, there was no mercy. They bombed places and didn't care if women or children were living there.
Tadei Yemelon fought for many years in the Bamileke region against the French and Cameroonian armies. He was badly wounded.
After we had been ambushed, I ran away and I fell in a hole. My wound was so bad I lost consciousness. Thankfully, someone carried me to the hospital.
He doesn't regret his years in the movement.
Better die standing than to live on your knees.
France's official position is slowly evolving. In 2009, Prime Minister François Fillon said accusations that France had taken part in the killing of rebel leaders were pure inventions. Last year in Cameroon, François Hollande was the first French president to admit there had been a repression, but he didn't say what actions France had carried out. Now some Cameroonian NGOs want to ask for reparations from France for its role in this war. A discreet war, but one in which tens of thousands of people were killed, according to French and Cameroonian historians.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined in the studio by Julie Owono, who heads the Africa Bureau at Internet Without Borders. Hello, thank you very much for being with us. Now, the notion of France-Afrique has always had a murky, worrying connotation, both on the political and the military front. Is it time for the French public to see what's under that veil of secrecy, do you think?
Absolutely. It was highly time for such secrecy to be lifted up for two reasons. The first reason is that from a diplomatic perspective, relationship between France and Cameroon have always been very friendly and very warm. But from a non-institutional point of view, that is to say the Cameroonian citizens, Cameroonian civil society intellectuals, there is now a sort of suspicion against the France as a state. This suspicion was expressed during François Hollande's trip in Yaoundé a few years ago, and was also expressed against the French ambassador in France, the former French ambassador in France, who was booed during a huge rally against Boko Haram by many Cameroonian citizens. So that frustration totally, absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely lies in the secrecy of the France-Afrique, how the France-Afrique was born, and it was namely born during the conflict that happened in Cameroon between 1955 and some say 1970 and others say 1962. And opening archives, opening testimonies on what happened in that war, will certainly appease the relationship and the feeling, the sentiments that Cameroonian people and intellectuals might have against the France as a state. And moreover, it's also very important for French citizens themselves. Many of them don't understand and don't know what has been done in their name in certain of the former colonist territories. And it's important today that with the age of information, with the fact that many people now have access to information that were kept secret, it's more and more difficult to hide these crimes. And hopefully, yes, the reports that France 24 has done and the one that France 5 had done back in 2007 already, France 5 being a French TV, public TV channel, also a book named Cameroon. All these documentaries have been very important and will continue to be very important to open up the speech and the discourse on what really happened. And what I think is important is to move from the historical perspective, but now go to the legal perspective and know what is legally, how legally those crimes can be named. We know that war crimes have been committed. There is this Max Vardet who apparently existed because in the book Cameroon, it was the authors doubted that he was a real army agent, but he actually existed, and he actually acknowledges and recognizes that he has committed war crimes. Now these war crimes fell under prescription, which is 30 years, so obviously they cannot be persecuted. But now there are other crimes that have been committed, and specifically the question is whether a genocide has happened in Cameroon. I'm asking the question, and others have asked the question following, orders and following publication by a general named General Lamberton, who is now dead, who was supervising the operations in Cameroon, operations for pacification of Cameroon, as it was called. And this general specifically says that the Bamileke people, which is a population in Western Cameroon, is an ethnic minority, which is a problem in the pacification of Cameroon. So saying this, ironically, most of the war operation theater were located in locations where Bamileke people had been identified. So legally, there is a question whether there was a physical element of a genocide, that is to say, killing a group of people, and the mental element of a genocide, which is intentionally targeting an ethnic or a racial or a religious group within a country. So I think with the opening of these arches and with the opening of, with all these documentaries, these questions, these historic questions will also be answered on the legal point of view.
And as you said, we are in an information age, and now that we're revealing all this information and it needs to be displayed and shared, how is your organisation helping with that?
Well, we are in favor of an open internet, and we know that the open internet has dramatically changed the general speech that was spread and disseminated when talking about colonization and the post-independence period in Africa. We are seeing today more and more people questioning their states. In Cameroon, for instance, to go back to the country we are talking about, there is a movement now in favor of erasing all the signs of the colonial past in the public space in Cameroon. For instance, there is the statue of General Leclerc, which was destroyed by a militant who was later arrested and jailed for a certain amount of time. Same in South Africa. In South Africa, we remember the Rhodes Must Fall rally and campaign, which eventually ended up bringing down the statue of Rhodes. So I think the information age and the openness of the internet, the ability to have access to certain documents that have been kept secret for such a long time, obviously allows this type of discussion today. I doubt that 5 years ago we'd have discussed this on France 24, a subject as a war in Cameroon on France 24. So,
Thank you very much for having spoken to us on behalf of Internet Without Borders.